There are moments in professional sports when a player doesn't have to criticize anyone, doesn't have to expose secrets, and doesn't have to make headlines with controversial statements to completely change how people view a situation. Sometimes all it takes is a single interview. Sometimes all it takes is a few carefully chosen words, a subtle shift in tone, or an expression that reveals far more than the speaker ever intended. That is exactly what happened when Myles Garrett appeared for the first time as a member of the Los Angeles Rams. The blockbuster trade itself was already one of the biggest stories of the NFL offseason. One of the most dominant defensive players of his generation had officially left the only franchise he had ever known and joined a team that many already viewed as a legitimate championship contender. The football implications were enormous. Analysts immediately began discussing pass rush combinations, Super Bowl odds, playoff projections, and how the Rams somehow managed to pull off yet another aggressive move, despite years of supposedly sacrificing their future. But almost immediately, something else started drawing attention. It wasn't the football analysis, it wasn't the contract details, it wasn't even the trade package. It was Myles Garrett himself. For nearly a decade, Garrett represented everything the Cleveland Browns wanted their organization to become. Through coaching changes, roster overhauls, quarterback controversies, and seasons filled with disappointment, he remained the one constant force that nobody questioned. Every year he delivered elite production. Every year he gave Browns fans a reason to believe. Every year he carried expectations that would have crushed most players. Through all of that, he always seemed composed, he always seemed measured, he always seemed careful about what he said publicly. Even during difficult seasons, he rarely allowed frustration to show. That became part of his identity. He was the superstar who handled chaos with professionalism. He was the franchise cornerstone who never publicly turned against the organization. He was the player who kept showing up no matter how difficult things became. That's why what happened during his first appearance with the Rams felt so different. People weren't just listening to his answers, they were studying them. They were comparing them to years of previous interviews. They were trying to understand why he suddenly seemed lighter, more relaxed, and more energized than they had seen him in years. And that's where this story becomes far more interesting than a simple trade breakdown. Because the biggest revelation from that interview wasn't something Garrett directly said. In fact, some of the most important details came from what he didn't say. For months, there had been speculation surrounding his future. Reports surfaced, rumors circulated. Some suggested he wanted to stay in Cleveland. Others claimed he had already decided that his future existed somewhere else. Fans debated endlessly about whether the trade was something Garrett truly wanted, or whether it was simply a business decision made by the organization. Depending on which report you believed, you could come away with a completely different understanding of what actually happened behind closed doors. The problem was that nobody had heard directly from Garrett after everything became official. Nobody knew exactly how he viewed the situation. Then the interview happened, and suddenly, a lot of assumptions started falling apart. What makes the entire situation fascinating is that Garrett never attacked Cleveland. He never criticized the front office. He never took shots at former coaches, teammates, or executives. In fact, he spoke respectfully about the organization that drafted him and gave him his NFL opportunity. On the surface, it sounded exactly like the type of professional response people would expect from him. But when you listen closely, another story starts to emerge. A story hidden inside the contrast between his reflections on the past and his excitement about the future. A story hidden inside the difference between how he discussed Cleveland and how he discussed Los Angeles. One sounded like a chapter that had reached its natural conclusion. The other sounded like the beginning of something he had been waiting for longer than most people realized. The more you examine those differences, the harder they become to ignore. And that is why this interview has become one of the most talked about moments of the entire offseason. Because whether Garrett intended it or not, many fans believe he revealed exactly how he felt about the final years of his Cleveland journey. Not through criticism, not through controversy, not through accusations, but through honesty. The kind of honesty that slips through when someone is genuinely excited about what comes next. The kind of honesty that can't always be hidden behind carefully prepared answers. By the end of this interview, one thing became impossible to deny. Myles Garrett wasn't acting like a player who had simply changed teams. He looked like a player who believed he had finally arrived exactly where he wanted to be. And if that's true, then this trade may tell us far more about the future of both franchises than anyone realized when the deal was first announced. The moment Myles Garrett sat down for his first official interview as a member of the Los Angeles Rams, something unusual happened. People stopped focusing on the trade itself and started focusing on him. Think about how rare that is. Normally, when a superstar changes teams, the conversation revolves around draft picks, salary implications, roster construction, championship odds, and whether the move was worth the cost. For a few hours, that's exactly what happened. Football analysts debated whether the Rams had once again pulled off the impossible. Fans argued over whether Cleveland got enough in return. Social media exploded with reactions from both fan bases. But then Garrett started talking, and suddenly the discussion shifted. People weren't debating the trade anymore, they were debating what Garrett's interview actually meant. Because the more people listened, the more they felt like they were hearing something much bigger than standard introductory press conference answers. At first glance, there was nothing particularly controversial about what Garrett said. He wasn't making headlines by attacking his former team, he wasn't calling out coaches, he wasn't exposing private conversations from inside the Browns organization. In fact, if someone only read a few quotes without watching the interview, they might wonder why the interview became such a major story in the first place. The answers themselves sounded respectful, professional, even grateful. Garrett repeatedly acknowledged his years in Cleveland and spoke positively about the opportunities the franchise gave him. On paper, it looked exactly like what fans expect from a veteran star leaving one organization and joining another. But interviews are rarely about words alone. Sometimes the most revealing information comes from the way someone delivers those words. Sometimes it comes from their energy, their enthusiasm, their body language, or the moments where they seem genuinely excited rather than simply polite. And that's where people started noticing something that couldn't easily be explained away. For years, Browns fans had become familiar with the version of Myles Garrett they saw in public. He was thoughtful, reserved, careful with every answer. Even after frustrating losses, he rarely let emotions take control. He carried himself like someone who understood the responsibility of being the face of a franchise. But during this interview, there were moments where that version of Garrett seemed completely different. The smiles came easier, the laughter sounded more natural, the excitement felt genuine rather than rehearsed. Viewers weren't just seeing a player introducing himself to a new team, they were seeing someone who appeared energized by a new opportunity, someone who seemed eager to discuss what was ahead instead of dwelling on what had been left behind. That distinction became impossible to ignore the longer the interview continued. What made the reaction even stronger was the timing. This wasn't months after the trade, this wasn't years removed from Cleveland, this was the very beginning. The emotions should have still been complicated. After all, Garrett had spent virtually his entire professional career with one organization. He had built relationships there, he had become a franchise icon there. He had invested nearly a decade trying to help turn the Browns into a legitimate contender. Walking away from all of that should have felt difficult. And to be fair, Garrett never denied that it was emotional. He openly acknowledged how much Cleveland meant to him. But many viewers couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching someone who had already made peace with that chapter long before the trade became official. Instead of sounding conflicted, he sounded relieved. Instead of sounding uncertain, he sounded convinced. Instead of sounding like a player mourning the end of something, he sounded like a player eager to begin something new. That perception only became stronger as fans began comparing his comments about Cleveland with his comments about Los Angeles. The contrast wasn't dramatic enough to create headlines on its own, but it was noticeable enough to create endless discussion online. When Garrett talked about Cleveland, the language often focused on appreciation, gratitude, and reflection. When he talked about the Rams, the language shifted toward excitement, opportunity, and possibility. One conversation sounded like someone looking back. The other sounded like someone looking forward. Neither approach was wrong. In fact, both were perfectly understandable. But together, they created a picture that many people weren't expecting to see. They created the impression that Garrett's emotional focus had already moved toward the future. And that's why this interview changed everything. Before it happened, people were still arguing about rumors. They were still debating anonymous reports and conflicting narratives. Nobody truly knew how Garrett viewed the trade because nobody had heard from him directly. After the interview, that uncertainty started disappearing, not because Garrett explicitly revealed every detail behind the scenes. He didn't. Not because he confirmed every rumor. He didn't do that either. The uncertainty faded because for the first time, fans got to observe how he felt rather than simply reading what others claimed he felt. And for many viewers, what they saw raised a question that would quickly become the center of the entire story. What if Garrett wasn't just accepting the move to Los Angeles?
What if he genuinely wanted it? Because once that question entered the conversation, everything surrounding the trade started looking very different. And what Garrett would reveal next only added more fuel to that growing belief. The detail that completely changed the conversation wasn't a touchdown, a sack total, or even a quote about winning championships. It was something much simpler, something that most casual fans overlooked when the trade first became official. Myles Garrett had a no-trade clause. On the surface, that might sound like a minor contractual detail, but in reality, it changes the entire story. Because a no-trade clause isn't just paperwork, it's power. It means the player controls his own future. It means no franchise can simply ship him wherever they want. It means that even if executives agree to a deal, nothing happens unless the player personally signs off on it. And once people started remembering that fact, the entire narrative surrounding Garrett's departure from Cleveland suddenly became far more complicated. For months, there had been endless speculation about what Garrett truly wanted. Depending on which report fans believed, the story looked completely different. Some reports suggested he still had strong ties to Cleveland and wanted to remain with the organization that drafted him. Others claimed frustration had been building behind the scenes for years and that he was quietly preparing for a fresh start elsewhere. As often happens during major NFL stories, anonymous sources, insider reports, and fan theories began creating multiple versions of reality. Every new report seemed to contradict the previous one. One day it sounded like Garrett wanted out. The next day it sounded like he was committed to staying. The situation became so confusing that many fans stopped trying to figure out what was actually true. Then, Garrett spoke for himself. And while he never directly addressed every rumor circulating online, one thing became impossible to ignore. He made it clear that he was not trapped in this situation. He wasn't a player who had been blindsided by a front office decision. He wasn't someone who suddenly discovered he had been shipped across the country against his wishes. The existence of the no-trade clause meant that Los Angeles only became a reality if Garrett allowed it to become a reality. That's the part of the story that many people couldn't stop thinking about, because once you understand that, the trade starts looking less like something that happened to him and more like something he actively chose. What's fascinating is how carefully Garrett handled the topic. He didn't sound angry, he didn't sound bitter, he didn't try to embarrass Cleveland or create unnecessary drama. In fact, he went out of his way to express appreciation for the organization and the city that supported him throughout his career. But appreciation and commitment are not the same thing. Gratitude and desire are not the same thing. A player can respect his past while still believing his future belongs somewhere else. And the more Garrett discussed the situation, the more many fans began reaching that exact conclusion. They started wondering whether the trade wasn't simply about leaving Cleveland. Maybe it was about pursuing something Cleveland could no longer provide. The timing makes that possibility even more intriguing. Garrett isn't an inexperienced rookie with years to wait for a rebuild. He isn't a developmental player hoping that someday everything comes together. He's already accomplished almost everything an individual player can accomplish. Pro Bowls, awards, recognition, dominance.
He has spent years proving that he belongs among the elite defensive players of his generation. The one thing missing from his resume is the one thing that every great player ultimately chases: a championship. That reality changes how a veteran views the future. It changes how he evaluates timelines. It changes how patient he's willing to be. And when fans looked at Cleveland's long-term plans compared to Los Angeles's immediate championship aspirations, many began to understand why the no-trade clause mattered so much. Because here's the uncomfortable question that emerged after the interview. If Garrett truly believed Cleveland offered the best opportunity to achieve his goals, why approve the trade at all? Why waive the protection that gave him complete control? Why agree to leave the franchise where he had spent nearly a decade building his legacy? Those questions don't automatically provide answers, but they do force people to reconsider assumptions. Suddenly, the idea that Garrett reluctantly left Cleveland became harder to defend. Suddenly, the possibility that he had already made peace with moving on started looking much more believable. And that's where the story becomes even more revealing. Because once fans stopped focusing on what Garrett said and started paying attention to how he said it, they noticed a contrast that may have revealed more than any direct statement ever could. The difference between his emotions when discussing Cleveland and his emotions when discussing Los Angeles wasn't dramatic enough to create controversy, but it was noticeable enough to leave people asking a very important question. Was Myles Garrett saying goodbye to Cleveland?
Or had he already said goodbye long before the trade ever happened? The most fascinating part of Myles Garrett's interview wasn't any single quote. It wasn't a headline-grabbing statement. It wasn't some shocking revelation that immediately exploded across social media. In fact, if you isolate most of his answers and read them individually, they sound completely harmless, respectful even. That's why so many people initially missed what was happening. The real story wasn't hidden inside one answer. It was hidden inside the contrast between all of them. It was hidden in the emotional gap between how Garrett discussed the place he left and the place he was heading. And once viewers started noticing that contrast, they couldn't stop seeing it. When Garrett talked about Cleveland, his language carried a very specific feeling. He spoke with appreciation, he spoke with gratitude, he acknowledged the journey, the experiences, and the people who helped shape his career. But there was another theme running through those comments as well: finality. Everything sounded complete, everything sounded settled. It felt like someone reflecting on an important chapter of his life that had already reached its conclusion. There was no bitterness attached to it, no anger, no resentment. Just the tone of someone who had already accepted that the story was over. That's an important distinction, because people often assume that leaving a franchise means there has to be some dramatic falling out behind the scenes. Garrett never gave that impression. Instead, he sounded like someone who simply believed he had gone as far as he could go in that environment. Now compare that to what happened whenever the conversation shifted toward Los Angeles. Suddenly the energy changed, the tone changed, the pace changed. Garrett didn't just answer questions about the Rams, he seemed genuinely excited to answer them. The difference wasn't subtle. When discussing the future, his responses became more animated. He smiled more, he laughed more. He talked about possibilities rather than memories. Instead of sounding reflective, he sounded energized. Instead of looking backward, he was looking forward. And that's the contrast that immediately caught people's attention. Because human beings are remarkably good at detecting genuine excitement. We can tell when someone is simply being polite, and we can usually tell when someone is talking about something they truly care about. Garrett looked like a man who couldn't wait to start the next phase of his career. One moment in particular perfectly captured that difference. During the interview, Garrett shared a story involving Rams head coach Sean McVay. It wasn't some earth-shattering revelation, it was actually a relatively simple story. Years earlier, after a game, McVay had told Garrett how difficult he was to prepare for and how much of a challenge he created for opposing offenses. On the surface, it's the type of football story that usually comes and goes without much attention, but Garrett's reaction while telling it was what stood out. There was a natural enthusiasm there, a genuine sense of excitement about the fact that the coach who once had to game plan against him would now be helping him succeed. It wasn't the story itself that mattered, it was how much Garrett clearly enjoyed talking about it.
And that's when many fans began connecting the dots, because throughout the interview, Garrett rarely displayed that same level of enthusiasm when discussing Cleveland. Again, that doesn't mean he was unhappy there. It doesn't mean he hated the organization. It doesn't mean there was secret hostility behind the scenes. Those would be unfair conclusions. But what it does suggest is that Garrett viewed the two situations very differently. One represented his past, the other represented his future. One represented what had already been accomplished, the other represented what was still possible. That's a huge distinction for a player entering one of the most important stretches of his career. The longer the interview continued, the harder it became to ignore that pattern. Whenever the conversation centered on Cleveland, Garrett spoke like someone honoring an important part of his journey. Whenever the conversation centered on Los Angeles, he spoke like someone chasing something he still desperately wanted. That's why so many viewers walked away with the same impression, despite hearing the exact same interview. Nobody needed Garrett to say, "I want it out." Nobody needed him to criticize the Browns or publicly explain every private frustration he may have experienced. The emotional contrast was already doing the talking. Sometimes what a person emphasizes tells you just as much as what they actually say. And that's exactly why this section of the interview became so powerful. Garrett never created controversy, he never started drama, he never attacked anyone. Yet somehow, many fans came away feeling like they had learned more about his true feelings than they would have from a dozen explosive headlines. Because while his words remained respectful throughout the entire conversation, his excitement told a different story. Not a story of resentment, not a story of anger, but a story of opportunity, a story of belief, a story of someone who genuinely felt that the next chapter of his career might be bigger than the last one.
And nowhere was that feeling more obvious than when Garrett began talking about the man many believe is the biggest reason elite veterans continue choosing Los Angeles over almost every other destination in football. Because once Sean McVay entered the conversation, the interview revealed something even more interesting about what Garrett may have been searching for all along. The more people analyzed Myles Garrett's first interview as a Ram, the more one name kept appearing at the center of the conversation: Sean McVay. At first, that might seem obvious. McVay is the head coach of the Rams. Naturally, a newly acquired superstar is going to say positive things about the man leading his new team. That's standard NFL behavior. Players praise coaches, coaches praise players. Everyone says the right things. Most of the time, those comments are forgotten within days, but this situation felt different, because Garrett wasn't simply complimenting his new coach. He was talking about McVay in a way that revealed something much bigger about what attracted him to Los Angeles in the first place. And the deeper you look into it, the harder it becomes to separate Sean McVay from the entire story of why Garrett chose this moment to leave Cleveland. When Garrett shared the story about meeting McVay years ago after a game, many people initially viewed it as a harmless anecdote. McVay reportedly told him that he was one of the most difficult players in football to prepare for. Garrett laughed while telling the story and seemed genuinely amused by how the football world had brought them together years later on the same sideline. On the surface, that's all it was, a funny football memory. But if you listen closely, that story carried a deeper meaning. Garrett wasn't talking about a coach he barely knew. He was talking about a football mind he clearly respected. And respect matters when you're a veteran player making one of the biggest decisions of your career. At some point, talent alone stops being enough. Players start looking for environments. They start looking for leadership. They start looking for organizations that consistently maximize the talent already on the roster. That's where McVay enters the picture. For nearly a decade, Sean McVay has built one of the most respected cultures in professional football. Think about how many elite veterans have chosen Los Angeles over the years. Think about how many players arrive there and immediately speak about the environment, the preparation, the attention to detail, and the expectation of competing for championships. That's not an accident. Organizations don't accidentally attract elite talent year after year. They earn that reputation. Players talk. Agents talk, coaches talk. Everyone in the league knows which franchises are stable and which franchises are constantly trying to find answers. And whether people agree or disagree with every decision the Rams have made, one thing is undeniable.
Sean McVay has built a reputation as someone players want to play for. Now compare that reality to what Garrett experienced throughout much of his career. During his years in Cleveland, the Browns went through multiple coaching staffs, multiple systems, multiple philosophies, and multiple attempts to build a contender. There were flashes of success, there were moments of optimism, there were seasons when it felt like the franchise was finally turning the corner, but there was instability, there were setbacks, there were years when expectations collapsed before they ever had a chance to become reality. Garrett lived through all of it. More importantly, he carried the burden of trying to overcome all of it. That's what makes his comments about McVay so interesting, because when a player openly praises something, people naturally begin wondering whether that praise reflects something he felt was missing elsewhere. To be clear, Garrett never directly compared Cleveland and Los Angeles. He never said one organization was better than the other. He never criticized his former coaches. But football fans don't just listen to words, they look for context, they look for meaning, and many fans noticed that Garrett seemed especially excited about joining a coach with a proven championship resume. Not a coach building towards contention, not a coach hoping to create a winning culture someday, a coach who had already done it, a coach who had already stood on the biggest stage in football and won. For a player entering his 30s and chasing the one achievement missing from his career, that distinction matters more than ever. What's even more revealing is how Garrett described the future under McVay. There was genuine enthusiasm in his voice when discussing what it would be like to work with someone who constantly finds ways to put players in positions to succeed. Again, that sounds like a simple compliment, but think about what that statement really means. Elite players don't just want opportunities, they want environments where those opportunities become championships. Garrett has already proven he can dominate individually. He doesn't need a new coach to teach him how to rush the passer. He doesn't need a new system to prove he's one of the best defensive players in football. What he needs is a situation where individual greatness finally translates to team success. And if Garrett believes Sean McVay provides that opportunity, then suddenly the trade starts making even more sense.
Perhaps that's why this part of the interview resonated so strongly with fans. It wasn't about football schemes, it wasn't about playbooks, it wasn't about defensive alignments or statistical projections. It was about belief. Garrett sounded like a player who genuinely believed he was joining an organization that knew exactly where it was going. After years of uncertainty, years of rebuilding, years of waiting for everything to finally come together, he now finds himself in a building led by a coach whose entire reputation is built on winning. That's not just attractive to a veteran player, that's almost impossible to ignore. And yet, as important as Sean McVay may have been in Garrett's decision, there was another factor that appeared even more powerful throughout the interview. Because every road in this story eventually leads back to the same destination, the same goal, the same obsession that has followed Garrett throughout his entire career. Not sacks, not awards, not recognition, a championship. And when Garrett began discussing that pursuit, he may have delivered the most honest answer of the entire interview. If there was one theme that appeared over and over throughout Myles Garrett's interview, it wasn't Sean McVay, it wasn't Los Angeles, it wasn't Cleveland. It was something far more powerful, a championship. Because when you strip away every other detail, every rumor, every trade discussion, every debate about organizational direction, the entire story eventually comes back to one simple reality. Myles Garrett has already accomplished almost everything a defensive player could ever dream of accomplishing. He has earned individual awards, he has dominated offensive lines, he has built a resume that will eventually place him among the greatest defensive players of his generation. Yet despite all of those achievements, there is still one empty space on that resume, one achievement that continues to matter more than everything else combined. And during this interview, Garrett made it clear that he is no longer interested in waiting indefinitely for that opportunity to arrive. That's what made one particular answer stand out from the rest. When the conversation turned toward championships, Garrett didn't hesitate. He didn't give the typical athlete response about focusing on one game at a time or trusting the process.
Instead, he sounded like a player who fully understands where he is in his career and exactly what he wants from the years he has left. That's an important distinction, because the NFL is filled with talented players who convince themselves that there will always be another opportunity down the road, another season, another rebuild, another chance. Garrett no longer sounds like one of those players. He sounds like someone who understands that championship windows don't stay open forever, even for the greatest athletes. And once a player reaches that realization, every decision starts being viewed through a completely different lens. Think about everything Garrett has already experienced. He has watched coaching staffs come and go. He has watched quarterbacks arrive with enormous expectations and leave with disappointing results. He has watched front offices make aggressive moves that failed to deliver the outcomes everyone expected. He has watched seasons begin with hope and end with frustration. Through all of it, he remained one of the most dominant defenders in football. Week after week, year after year, he did his part. Yet football is the ultimate team sport. Individual greatness can only carry a franchise so far. At some point, even the best players in the world need the organization around them to match their ambitions. And after nearly a decade of carrying that responsibility, it's fair to wonder whether Garrett finally decided that waiting was no longer enough. What's fascinating is that Garrett never framed the situation as choosing personal success over team success. In fact, he appeared to reject that idea entirely. He spoke about the possibility of achieving both, winning championships while still pursuing greatness, chasing records while helping his team compete for titles. That's a mindset that tells you a lot about how he views himself at this stage of his career. He doesn't believe he has to sacrifice one goal for another. He believes he can still be the most disruptive defender in football while also playing meaningful games deep into January and February. And if that's truly his belief, then Los Angeles becomes an incredibly logical destination.
Because when Garrett talks about championships, he doesn't sound like someone chasing a miracle. He sounds like someone chasing probability. That's a huge difference. Every team enters a season believing they have a chance. Every fan base talks itself into optimism. But veteran players see things differently. They evaluate coaching stability. They evaluate roster construction. They evaluate organizational direction. Most importantly, they evaluate timelines. Garrett knows he doesn't have the luxury of waiting through another lengthy rebuild. He knows he doesn't have 5 or 6 years to see whether a young core eventually develops into a contender. His window is now. His prime is now. And when he looks across the league, he sees a Rams organization that believes its championship window is also open right now. That may explain why one of the most revealing moments of the interview came when Garrett discussed the future rather than the present. He didn't speak as though Los Angeles was a short-term stop. He didn't sound like a veteran trying to squeeze one final playoff run out of the final years of his career. Instead, he sounded like someone investing in a long-term vision, someone who believes the organization is positioned to compete not just this season, but for years to come. That's a significant statement, because it suggests Garrett wasn't merely searching for a contender, he was searching for a football home, a place where he could pursue every goal still remaining on his list without constantly wondering whether the organization around him would be able to keep pace. And perhaps that's the most important part of this entire story. For years, fans viewed Garrett as the face of Cleveland's future. Now, Garrett appears to be viewing Los Angeles as the key to his own future. Not because he stopped caring about the Browns, not because he suddenly became dissatisfied with everything he experienced there, but because he reached a point where ambition demanded action. The pursuit of a championship stopped being a distant dream and became an urgent priority. When that happens, players begin making decisions that might seem difficult emotionally, but make perfect sense professionally. The truth is that championships have a way of revealing what matters most to elite athletes. They expose priorities, they force difficult choices, they make players confront timelines they would rather ignore.
And judging by everything Garrett said during that interview, the pursuit of a Super Bowl wasn't simply one factor in his decision. It may have been the factor, the force quietly driving everything behind the scenes long before the trade became official. But if the championship chase explains why Garrett left, it also raises another question. What exactly was he leaving behind? Because while Los Angeles is focused on winning right now, Cleveland appears focused on something entirely different, and understanding that difference may explain why this separation became inevitable in the first place. Here's the part of the story that many people don't want to discuss because it forces everyone involved to confront an uncomfortable possibility. What if Myles Garrett was right to leave, and what if the Browns were right to let him go? Those two ideas sound contradictory at first, but the deeper you examine Cleveland's current situation, the more realistic they become. Because while most of the attention has focused on Garrett's decision, far less attention has been paid to what the Browns are actually trying to accomplish. This isn't the same Cleveland team that Garrett entered the league with. It's not even the same Cleveland team from 3 years ago. The organization is moving in a completely different direction now. The problem is, that direction doesn't necessarily align with the timeline of a 31-year-old superstar who wants to win a championship immediately. For years, the Browns operated under the belief that they were 1 or 2 moves away from becoming legitimate contenders. Every offseason brought another major acquisition. Every season began with renewed expectations. Every setback was treated as a temporary obstacle rather than a fundamental problem. But eventually, reality catches up with every organization. Injuries happen. Draft picks miss expectations. Expensive contracts fail to deliver the results people envisioned. Plans change, priorities shift, and slowly, almost without anyone realizing it, Cleveland found itself facing a difficult truth. The timeline that once revolved around maximizing Myles Garrett's prime had started transforming into a timeline centered on the future. That's where things become incredibly complicated, because rebuilding is easy to talk about and extremely difficult to execute. Fans hear the word and immediately think about young talent, draft picks, and future potential. What they don't think about is the cost. Every rebuild requires sacrifices. Every rebuild requires difficult decisions. Every rebuild requires an organization to accept short-term pain in exchange for long-term hope. The Browns appear to have reached that point. Whether people agree with it or not, their actions suggest they are no longer focused solely on winning right now. They're focused on building something that can sustain success years down the road. And once that became the organizational priority, the fit between Cleveland and Garrett suddenly became much less obvious.
Think about the players who now represent the future of the franchise. Young talent, developmental pieces, prospects with enormous upside but limited experience, players who may need multiple seasons before reaching their full potential. That's not a criticism. That's simply the reality of building a young core. Growth takes time. Chemistry takes time. Development takes time. The question is whether Myles Garrett had enough time left to wait for all of that to happen. From his perspective, the answer may have been obvious. He has already spent nearly a decade waiting for the perfect combination of talent, coaching, health, and organizational stability to come together. How many more years should he realistically invest in another long-term project? And that's the part many fans struggle with emotionally. Because Garrett wasn't just another player, he was the face of the franchise. He represented an entire era of Browns football. For many supporters, he embodied everything they wanted the organization to become. Seeing a player like that leave naturally feels like failure. It feels like the end of something important. But football history is filled with examples of franchises making painful decisions because they believed those decisions were necessary for the future. The question isn't whether losing Garrett hurts. Of course it hurts. The question is whether Cleveland believes the pain will eventually be worth it. What's particularly interesting is how differently both sides now view the future. Myles Garrett looks at the next 2 or 3 years and sees a championship opportunity. The Browns look at the next 2 or 3 years and see a development process.
Miles has focused on maximizing the remaining prime years of an already legendary career. Cleveland appears focused on constructing a foundation that could potentially support success for the next decade. Neither perspective is irrational. In fact, both make perfect sense when viewed through their respective timelines. The problem is that those timelines no longer overlap. That's why the trade feels so symbolic. It wasn't simply a transaction involving draft picks and players. It represented two different visions separating from one another. One side is chasing immediate contention, the other side is investing in future potential. One side is trying to win now, the other side is trying to build something sustainable. And somewhere along the way, both sides realized they could no longer pursue those goals together. What makes this situation even more fascinating is that Cleveland's future now depends on a collection of variables that nobody can accurately predict. Young players must develop, draft picks must become impact contributors, coaching decisions must work, the quarterback situation must stabilize. Dozens of moving pieces have to come together at exactly the right time. That's the gamble every rebuilding team makes. Sometimes it works brilliantly. Sometimes it falls apart completely. Nobody knows which outcome awaits the Browns yet. But here's what we do know. The moment Cleveland committed to a longer-term vision, Myles Garrett became one of the most valuable trade assets in football. And the moment Garrett decided his championship window couldn't wait any longer, Los Angeles became one of the most attractive destinations imaginable. Suddenly, what once seemed impossible started looking inevitable. The irony is that both sides may eventually get exactly what they want. Myles Garrett may get his opportunity to compete for championships immediately. Cleveland may eventually build the young foundation it believes can sustain success for years. But if that happens, the trade will be remembered very differently depending on who succeeds first. And that's where the story takes another fascinating turn. Because while Cleveland is betting on the future, Myles Garrett isn't thinking about 5 years from now. He's thinking about history. He's thinking about legacy. And he's chasing a record that could place him in an entirely different category of NFL greatness. As important as championships are to Myles Garrett, there is another goal quietly driving him every season, and it may be even more ambitious than winning a Super Bowl. Because while fans spend most of their time debating team success, the greatest players in sports often think about something bigger: legacy. Not the kind of legacy built through social media popularity or highlight reels, but the kind that survives decades after a player retires. The kind that forces future generations to mention your name whenever they discuss the greatest to ever do it. And for Myles Garrett, that conversation increasingly revolves around one number: 200. At first glance, the number doesn't seem particularly dramatic. 200 what? 200 sacks. But NFL fans understand exactly what that means. Reaching 200 career sacks isn't just another statistical milestone. It's one of the most difficult achievements in the history of professional football. It requires extraordinary talent, extraordinary durability, and extraordinary consistency over a very long period of time. Most players never even come close. Some Hall of Famers spend entire careers producing at elite levels and still finish nowhere near that mark. That's what makes Garrett's pursuit so fascinating. He's no longer competing against the current generation of pass rushers. He's competing against history itself.
What's remarkable is how openly Garrett discusses that goal. Many athletes avoid talking about records because they don't want to appear focused on individual accomplishments. Garrett doesn't seem interested in pretending the goal doesn't exist. He knows exactly where he stands. He knows exactly how many sacks he has accumulated. And he knows exactly what it would mean to someday challenge the greatest pass rushing records the sport has ever seen. That's not arrogance, that's clarity. Elite athletes often become great because they are willing to pursue goals that sound impossible to everyone else. Garrett has never hidden from those kinds of expectations. If anything, he seems motivated by them. The timing of his move to Los Angeles suddenly makes even more sense when viewed through that lens, because reaching 200 sacks isn't simply about talent. It's about opportunity. It's about putting yourself in situations where you can continue producing year after year. It's about joining an environment that allows you to maximize every remaining season of your prime. And when Garrett looks at the Rams, he doesn't just see a championship contender. He sees a roster built to help him continue dominating. He sees a coaching staff capable of creating favorable matchups. He sees a defensive front loaded with talent. Most importantly, he sees a situation where opposing offenses can no longer dedicate their entire game plan to stopping him. That's a huge change from what Garrett experienced for much of his career. For years, offensive coordinators built protection schemes specifically designed to slow him down. Double teams became routine. Extra blockers became routine. Entire offensive game plans often revolved around preventing Garrett from taking over a game. That's the price of being the most feared defender on the field. The better you are, the more attention you receive. But now, imagine being an offensive coordinator trying to handle Garrett while also worrying about multiple dangerous pass rushers surrounding him. Suddenly, those decisions become far more complicated. Suddenly, there are consequences for focusing too heavily on one player. That's why so many analysts immediately began projecting enormous production for Garrett in Los Angeles. The scary part for the rest of the league is that Garrett doesn't sound satisfied, not even close. Sometimes when veteran players reach a certain stage of their careers, they begin talking about slowing down, preserving their bodies, extending their careers. Garrett sounds like the exact opposite. He talks like someone who believes his best football may still be ahead of him. He talks like someone who sees unfinished business rather than accomplishments. That's a dangerous mindset when you're already one of the most dominant defensive players in the NFL. Because hungry players improve, motivated players improve, but players chasing history often operate on an entirely different level.